Welcome to Worldwide Migration Partners Immigration Update. I'm Melissa Vincenty, and I'm the Managing Director of Worldwide Migration Partners. I wanted to get on the video today to be able to just give some quick updates on international travel, as I know some of you, a lot of you, really want to travel now. And I recently had the opportunity to do that. I was able to travel back to the United States in March, and it was an interesting experience, to say the least. A lot of paperwork to do and a lot of things I had to keep in mind. So I thought I would just hop on the video today and give you all some tips and otherwise things that you can do in order to prepare for that travel. So one of the things you're going to want to be thinking about in the coming months is the time that you're going to be traveling. Remember, travel back and forth to Australia and the United States will pick up in the summer months from the US side because of school holidays. That's happening now. So into May, June, July, from travel from the US to Australia, that will definitely pick up. On the flip side of that, during the holiday period, during November, December, January, even last year when we still had a lot of restrictions and there was only a little bit of opening up happening, there was some difficulty in travel due to not as many flights, not as much happening in terms of travel back and forth. So I expect that this year will be back to almost normal when it comes to travel. So there's some things to keep in mind, thinking ahead a little bit if you're planning to either come back during this winter/summer period, depending on where you're coming from, Australia or the US, as well as thinking ahead to the end of the year. So the first thing I wanted to just remind everybody, because you may not have done this in a while, is go and look at your passports. First, locate them and make sure that you have them somewhere. We've had several clients not be able to locate their passports initially because they put them away, haven't had to use them or see them in a couple of years. So you want to go find out, first of all, where your passports are. All right, so once you have your passports, I would like you to go and look at the expiration date of the passports. Now that goes both ways. So on your Australian passports, make sure that you have enough validity left on your Australian passports as well as US passports. And let me just talk about the bit of differences when we're talking about expiration. So on the Australian side, if you happen to have an Australian passport or you're a dual citizen and you happen to have both, you're going to want to make sure that children, minor children, their passports are not going to expire during the period of travel or even be expired now. If they are expired and you are in Australia, you certainly can go to an Australian post office and get that renewal done. Renewals are backlogged slightly, so you want to allow about 6 to 8 weeks for a normal renewal. I've had to recently do my son's, so I'm still waiting for his to be renewed. But you can also get an expedited renewal done with 3 to 5 business days. So that is an option if you notice that your passport's going to expire or it's already expired. You want to take care of that as soon as possible, especially minor children, because remember, they're only good for 5 years. The new US passports are quite interesting. I had my renewed back in February, March. It took me as an adult about 4 weeks to get the renewal done, being in Australia and sending it to the consulate in Perth. But mine came back with the new style. So the new style is going to have a very hard page. So this is the traditional bio page and the down below. But this page is hard. It's laminated because it has a chip in it. So these are the new style US passports. So if you have a renewal coming up, you'll be getting the new style of passport. And so the difficulty comes around, especially with US passports, and you're trying to renew them in Australia. The difficulty is especially for children who got their previous passports and they were under the age of 16. If that's the case, like it was my son, then you're going to have to go in person to be able to renew that passport, even though they're now over the age of 16. Again, exactly the same situation with my son right now. So that's going to require an in-person appointment by both parents, unless one parent signs off on an affidavit that they're not attending the appointment. And you're going to have to try and hunt now for an appointment. Now, this is quite difficult at the moment because, as we all know, as I'm recording this video at the beginning of May, the Sydney consulate is still closed. So it's not only closed for non-immigrant visa appointments and foreign appointments, it's also basically closed for U.S. citizen services. And that causes a lot of difficulty in terms of travel, now that travel is picking up during these months, and you need to get your child's passport or your own passport renewed, but you have to attend an appointment. Now, the rule of thumb is that Sydney will not entertain any appointments, regular appointments. They may look at an emergency appointment or an urgent appointment if you have imminent travel. And from what I understand, a lot of our clients, they're looks like they're able to get that appointment, but only within 3 weeks of travel, which is nerve wracking. I get it. It's completely nerve wracking to not have that passport in hand. And so you want to plan a little bit ahead, or maybe even think about maybe doing that trip later in the year or when things start to regularize a little bit. We've had clients fly to Melbourne, fly to Perth. Those appointments are also hard to get. They do open up, so you'll want to just keep a track of the calendar, almost like have that tab open, check it once or twice a day if you're trying to snag an appointment a little bit closer to home. But I sympathize with all of you who are trying to do that. It's not a good situation for the U.S. citizens who are trying to get those passports renewed, but there is a little bit of relief currently. So if you're a U.S. passport holder and you've had a previous passport and that passport expired after January 1st, 2020, you're able to travel to the United States on that expired passport. Now that's good for that entry. And so you want to make sure that if you are doing that, you're going to have enough time in the United States to be able to renew that passport onshore in the US. Now, those appointments are taking several weeks as well. So even in an expedited way, you can expect a little bit of a backlog on getting those passports back. So we've had several clients talk to us about possibly taking their children, their younger children, for longer visits during this American summer, and then thinking about then doing that passport renewal before they return to Australia. So there's different ways to maybe figure this out, but it is complicated at the moment, and it can be extremely frustrating now that we are over some of the travel restrictions that we've had and we want to reunite families, but passports have been expired. Now, talking about getting an Australian passport renewed in the United States, that's a whole nother ballgame. There's same thing. There are Australian missions around the United States, as most of you know who are watching this, and there's backlogs on getting renewals or getting expedited passports as well. So if you're in the U.S. as an Aussie and you want to get those passports renewed, you again, for the most part, really try to plan ahead. Unless it's emergency, we all know these things happen. So just be aware that that is a new wrinkle, something that we haven't had to deal with in a while in terms of the backlog of appointments. So the next thing you want to also do is check your own passport. Make sure that it has at least 6 months validity. If you're going to certain countries that require that 6 months validity, the US is not one of those, but other places around Europe and other countries, you have to check to make sure that if you have less than 6 months validity, if you can enter that country. So be aware of that. I'll maybe make this week passport week. Go check the passports. I use a spreadsheet. I do alerts on my spreadsheet. So I have to manage, 6 passports, for between 3 people because we're dual citizens. And I just kind of try to keep track of when they're going to expire and try to do it well in advance. Well, again, couldn't do it during COVID. And so now we're trying to do that. So we have travel planned later in the year. So we're definitely going to, as a family, want to get that sorted. The next thing we want to think about are travel. So travel plans, our flights, I get the question a lot, are flights being canceled? Are there caps? All that. A lot of what we dealt with in COVID times during, the travel restrictions and the travel bans and the caps on arrivals, that's pretty much non-existent now. So that's the good news. As of April was a great month because a lot of those restrictions went away. And now it's pretty much open travel. So let me just break it down. I know it is quite confusing in terms of whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated. So I'll first talk about vaccinated travelers. If you're an Australian citizen or a permanent resident, you no longer need a travel exemption to leave Australia. So you're free to leave Australia. You don't need to have that special permission that we had to have previously. You're free to go. So that's great news. That's if you're vaccinated. Now, vaccinated, remember, means at least 2 shots. And so you want to make sure that you have that up to date. Don't need to have the 3rd booster in order to be considered fully vaccinated, at least for now. That's what the Australian government is requiring. So 2 shots, vaccination certificates up to date. Make sure that's all done. So all of these things right now that I'm talking about apply to vaccinated travelers. So no need for a outbound exemption. There's also no need for an inbound exemption anymore for those people who are not Australians or permanent residents, so temporary visa holders. You no longer need an exemption to enter Australia. So that's great news. Students are welcome back, travelers, visitors. We don't need to show that you are part of an Australian family, for example. We don't need to show that anymore. So you don't need to have that particular requirement met. So you're free to come back. Also, you do not have to quarantine on arrival. The only place you have, so in Victoria, in New South Wales, and Queensland, there is no more any type of quarantine for vaccinated travelers. So no need to worry about that. Also in WA, that's the case. Now, it does change when you talk about unvaccinated travelers. So let's hop over to that for a moment. The other one thing that I wanted to mention is also going interstate into WA. Say you're flying into Sydney and you need to travel on to WA. If you're vaccinated, you again do not need to quarantine and you don't have to have triple vaccination. So that's kind of the updates on vaccinated travelers. So let's jump over to unvaccinated travelers because I get this question a lot. And there's still people who are unvaccinated. That's natural for many different reasons. But things have gotten better in that case as well. So unvaccinated citizens and permanent residents also do not need to have a travel waiver to leave Australia. They also do not need that travel waiver to enter Australia. So they're free to come and go in and out of Australia without needing those exemptions. Now, when you're talking about entry, though, there may be caps to entry. Now, those caps to entry only really apply realistically in WA. So WA still has caps on unvaccinated travelers as an international traveler coming in directly into Perth, which isn't the majority of travelers, but I do want to mention it because I do get this question sometimes. If you're unvaccinated and you are a citizen or permanent resident, you still have a 7-day mandatory quarantine, and that's paid at your expense. And so oftentimes we have clients that will just not do the direct flight, so they don't have to do that 7-day quarantine. Once they've entered New South Wales or Queensland or Victoria, eventually they can head back over to WA on a domestic flight. So that's the biggest thing, the biggest difference, that still remains for that quarantine. So that's good news for families that have both unvaccinated and vaccinated travelers within them. And there's also no G2G pass for WA that is required any longer. So those of you who had to fill those out for WA previously, you don't need to get that special interstate pass anymore. So that's also done with. There's also very interesting in April, also the Australian government, they dropped the requirement for pre-flight testing to come to Australia. So that applies to both flights and now the cruise ships, when the cruise ships have now started up. There's no pre-entry testing required, which was a little bit surprising, but I think that wanted to get back to a normal type of international movement. And so that pre-flight testing is not required to come into Australia. I'll talk about the United States in a moment, but for Australian entries, so if you're away, if you're Australian and you're coming back to Australia, you don't need to try and get that test done. When I went to the US in March, that was still required, and I'll go through kind of what I went through so you all understand where I got my tests and things like that. But to come back to Australia currently, you do not need any testing required. You will, however, depending on the state, there are going to be requirements and or suggestions about doing a rapid antigen test, so a RAT test, upon arrival. So in New South Wales, the guidelines are you're supposed to go directly to your place of residence or to your accommodations from the airport. You are not to go out until you receive a negative RAT test. And if you are positive, you are to remain at your accommodation and register your RAT test with New South Wales Health on the app. And then there's protocol for 7 days about isolation, so confinement. So you have to just go online to New South Wales Health and figure out, make sure that if that applies to you and you do get a positive test within 24 hours, that you follow those guidelines for those who have tested positively. So that is the requirement for New South Wales. For Victoria, I think they only suggest the RAT test. It's not technically a requirement, but they highly recommend that all passengers, and I probably would do that anyway too, within 24 hours, just test yourself, make sure that you're testing negative, or if you start to show symptoms, you need to go get a PCR test. So that's what is required for those two states. Queensland also, I believe it's a test upon within 24 hours of arrival internationally. So you want to make sure that you're following those guidelines. And also, no matter where you're coming from, which state, most of the states have that requirement of for 7 days to try and stay away from elderly facilities, hospitals if you can, those types of high risk areas. There is the suggestion that even if you're testing negative, to just be really aware of going into those environments after having come from overseas or being on an airplane for many hours. So those are the suggestions and or requirements for testing. Let's talk about on the flip side if you're going to the US, because again, this question we get quite often. So going to the United States right now, it is required that you show a minimum negative RAT test, a rapid antigen test that's been supervised. So it's not like you can just take the test at home and bring the stick with you and show the airline that you have tested negative. It has to be a supervised test that ends up with a report at the end that can be presented to the airline upon check-in. So that can be done in different ways now in Australia. Up until like even a month ago, it wasn't as regular to be able to get those done at your local chemists. But I do understand, for example, Terry White chemists, some of the other chemists do that supervised RAT test and will provide the proper report that you need. They will know what to do if it's for travel. You have to specify that it's for travel to the United States or wherever you're going that requires a rapid antigen test. And make sure you have the right report. That's really important because you don't want to be stuck with not having the correct report and you've gone to the trouble of doing a test. Now, the test also has to be done within 1 day of travel. So some people get a bit confused because it does say 24 hours or 1 day. You can actually have, if you, for example, are flying on a Wednesday, you can have the test done anytime on the Tuesday previous to that. Or you can do it on Wednesday, whatever, but it has to be within 1 day of that travel. And that's, you just want to sort that out, make sure you don't leave it to the last minute. One of the options and the thing that I did when I traveled to the US in March is I just booked myself into the airport testing facility. It's run by Histopath in New South Wales and I believe in Queensland as well, but Victoria, so in Melbourne and Sydney. It's really, really super easy. Some people may flinch at the price. It's $59 for the RAT test. But I found it really, really efficient. I booked it ahead of time. I already had my paper with the QR code rocked up to, they have it right near departures in Sydney, for example, rocked up with an extra hour or two, got my test done, went and had something to eat with my husband. And then once my test came through and I was notified via text, I had it in my phone, so I was able to then go check in. So really the lines aren't long. I was taking an evening flight, so maybe that's why the lines weren't that long either. You don't need to get a PCR test, so that's $79. If you want to get one, you can. $79 at the Histopath, you can do that. But I chose to do the RAT test, so the $59 RAT test, you can have that done. Now that's sufficient to travel to the United States. So you just want to make sure that you have enough time at the airport, or you do it the day before prior to finish packing your bags. Just make sure that that is done before you go. Other things that you need to prepare for the United States, obviously you want to make sure you have your visa in hand. If you are traveling on an ESTA or a visa waiver, you want to make sure that that's up to date, that hasn't expired, make sure that that registration is up to date. You want to make sure you have all your documents kind of in order. If you are traveling and you're not a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident of the U.S., you must be vaccinated. So you have to show your international vaccination certificate. So again, what I did is I went on to my Medicare account online, was able to transfer over the information, and there is a button that you just click on getting an international vaccine certificate. And that was super helpful. Literally took me like 3 minutes. So was able to do that. I chose to print it out and have it in my phone. So I had kind of both copies. You'll probably want to print it out for ease of use if you have to show it at different places and you don't have phone reception in the US, or if you don't have like a phone plan or anything like that. So you want to make sure You either have a picture in your phone of it that you can show it. That was acceptable. A lot of people had that, just a picture of their certificate that could be reviewed. I had a hard copy and in my phone, so I was really well prepared. So if you're a U.S. citizen, though, or permanent resident, you can travel to the United States without being vaccinated. You'll have to obviously have your green card or your passport. That's handy. Should be fine. I haven't traveled with an unvaccinated passenger yet, so I'm pretty sure the process is exactly the same. You'll get checked at the airport. They'll check that you have citizenship or are a permanent resident. They'll check you. You still need to have that RAT test done, so you'll have that answered for them to show a check-in, and then you're good to go. So that's kind of what it was like for the U.S. Now, my check-in, I flew with Hawaiian Airlines. It was super easy, super chill. There was like not a big deal about the paperwork. Everything kind of was they had it set up very well. They pre-checked you before you got into line and things like that. Now, when I flew to Hawaii, I have to say there was still a mask mandate in the United States on federal transportation. So I had to wear a mask all the way to the U.S., all the way to Hawaii. In Hawaii, then they had their own state mandate. So when I flew, that was still in place. So in all public places, you still had to wear masks. And it was interesting that the flight attendants needed to remind everybody of that because things had already relaxed in New South Wales. So we were used to not wearing masks in New South Wales, but obviously they want to remind people if you're going to the state of Hawaii at that time, you had to wear a mask. Now that's been lifted, so on any federal transport in the U.S. and in the last couple of weeks, that's been now lifted. You don't have to wear a mask on an airplane, but you certainly are welcome to. And in some places in the United States, you just want to be mindful that it's not the same across the board. So some locales may have certain requirements for vaccination certificates, and that's why it's important to have your international vaccine certificate done correctly. And some may have some masking protocol as well. So obviously when you're traveling, you just ask those questions. Make sure you have masks with you. That's a mouthful. And make sure you have your vaccine certificate. And, there will be that times where it's going to be confusing, but best to ask those questions. Now, I understand coming back to Australia, there's a couple things you need to do. And remember, coming back to Australia, you do need to wear a mask. So that's still required because it's still required in a federal way on transportation. So when you go to the airports in Australia, you will see that people are wearing masks. And also on the airplane for example, if I was flying back from Hawaii, from Honolulu, I'd be required on that leg from Honolulu back to Sydney to wear a mask. That's my understanding. I'm going back in a few weeks, so we'll see if that's still the case. But that's my understanding is that because Australia requires it within their federal aviation guidelines, that's going to be required. So again, it is frustrating. I get it. But this is kind of the price we pay right now to just be able to travel again. Some of these things will even out over time, over the next couple of months, but there is going to be a bit of disparity here and there, and so you have to go with the flow a bit. The other big change, and this has nothing to do with visas and nothing to do with COVID. Well, I think it does have to do with COVID, but the biggest change is most airlines now will only allow you to check one bag to the United States. Now, up until COVID, for those who are frequent travelers, we could always check two bags. So two bags, usually 23 kilos, sometimes more. Hawaiian, it's like 32 kilos, as I recall, or something, 25 kilos. Hawaiian Airlines still allows you to check two bags internationally, but most airlines have, even including Qantas, has now gone to the one bag policy. So who knows why? I mean, I think, they want to gain some extra revenue. Fuel has gone up. I get all that. But that policy seems to just have died during COVID. They could do whatever they wanted during COVID, and I think that's going to stay. So be careful if you're connecting flights through, for example, if you're flying to Los Angeles and you're flying on a different airline from Los Angeles elsewhere. If you've checked two bags to Los Angeles, they're going to charge you. And some airlines have no baggage allowance. So similar to Jetstar or some of the other airlines, again, in the U.S., some of the economy airlines are not going to have any policy. So you're going to have to make sure that you have some extra cash or that you're aware of those baggage policies because they change automatically. So if you're changing planes in Los Angeles and it's not like connected to your international flight, you're paying for that extra luggage. So those are just some things that maybe because you haven't traveled in a while, may have forgotten, or things that have slightly changed. And then returning to Australia, the last thing I wanted to mention is there is still the requirement. Now, it may not be for the next couple of weeks. I may put this video out and it may change, but there is still a requirement to fill out a passenger declaration form. And I think it's called a DBT now, as I recall. I'm just looking for the exact name, but I had to fill it out when I came back in March. It's online. It's fairly easy to fill out. It asks about your COVID status. It asks if you have had COVID and when. So if you don't know those dates exactly, just make sure you have that somewhere in your phone or something. I got COVID when I came back to Australia. And so I know the exact date and I know when I recovered. So that if those questions come up of whether or not I've recovered from COVID, I can answer those questions fairly easily. So that particular form, you need to go online and do that within 72 hours of your flight. Like I said, you can do it on your phone. You can do it on your desktop if you want. Excuse me. Or you can do it on your desktop if you want. But that form needs to be done before you check in for your Australia bound flight. A lot of people, when I was checking in Hawaii, hadn't thought about it, hadn't done it, hadn't heard it. And it really held up the check-in process for a lot of people because it does take, I would say, 5 to 10 minutes to fill out. So people were desperately trying to do it on their phone and trying to get that done before they got up to check in. So just try and make sure that you're checking that to make sure that that's still required. It probably will still be required because it asks about COVID infection and how you're feeling and things like that. So it probably will still be around. And just make sure that you're doing that before returning to Australia. So those are all the updates that I have for now. I'll be back in another week or two to give you more updates. I'll be traveling again to the US in June. So I'm happy to share what I'm experiencing now in terms of flights. For the most part, I can just tell you the airlines are happy to be back. The flight attendants are all like super helpful. They're there to answer questions. And, they deserve to be treated well. So, even though we see some of these stories about flight attendants not getting the best attention or having to deal with unruly passengers, that's not the normal. I'm hoping it's not the normal, but they're happy to be back at work, and it's great that we can travel again. So wishing you all happy travel planning. Any questions, please give us a call at Worldwide Migration Partners. We're here to answer those questions. Listen, we're in it every day. We are following these things every day. We are attuned to where appointments are for passports. We're across that because that's what we're doing in it every day. So if you want to get some information about updates or your particular situation, please give us a call or find out on our website, www.worldwidemigrationpartners.com. And I'll see you guys again shortly. Have a wonderful week. Enjoy and happy travels.